Rick Hills. I teach law at NYU Shanghai, NYU Shanghai and NYU New York City. I'm in New Mexico right now, a third place. And I am your host today for a really exciting presentation by my co-author and friend, distinguished property scholar, Professor Qiao Shitong. Professor Qiao has been a professor at HKU, where he taught property and did path-breaking and award-winning research on how property regimes evolved informally and spontaneously in Shenzhen. He has done research, survey research, and also interview research, sociological research on homeowners associations in Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. And he has written too many articles to count, including some with me, on a variety of topics ranging from takings to bonds. So we're delighted to have him here to talk about basically the organization of ordinary people and civil society in Shanghai during COVID lockdown. And in addition, and very exciting, we have Kenney Zhu, who is a resident of Shanghai and is firsthand and right now participating in the organization of residents in Shanghai to deal with the various crises that are brought about by COVID, including, of course, the distribution of food. So in any way, our basic plan this morning is to hear from Kenney, our guy in Shanghai, man on the ground, to give us a firsthand report of what life is like and how people are organizing and working together and getting to know their neighbors. Okay. And second, we'll hear from Shitong and some of his discussions with other people in Shanghai and his general observations about how civil society and informal interaction works so that people can work together to solve problems. So guys, take it away. Kenney?
Okay, hello everyone, I'm Kenney. Let me share the screen. Okay, so hello everyone, I'm Kenney. Today I'm going to talk about how building food captains, BFC, work in my community. And I'm currently living in Shanghai and work for a non-profitable organization. I am also a traveler and have explored 17 countries. So the presentation will consist of 5 parts, including a community profile, Zhu's work, why I started and what we did, and at the end, there were some interesting findings. So here's something about the community. The community I lived in is an old community. It was built around 30 years ago. There were more than 3,000 residents in this community, and judging from my personal observation, around 15% of the residents are above 60 years old. The government did a lot to help residents from the very beginning, and I will introduce a concept here, which is Zhu, generally translated as Government Neighborhood Committee. It has done a lot during these days, including the nucleic acid testing assistance, special care for the elderly group, including extra food supply, distribute medicines ordered online by government resource, help the patients go to the hospital to see doctors and prescribe medicine, maintain government guaranteeing supply channels, including free packages and self-paid packages. The reason why I started to do something for the community is it was a bit difficult to get vegetables in the first week. So I went to Zhu's office to make a reservation for the vegetable package on March 30th. And many people waiting in line for the reservation, which was dangerous since the virus was spreading and all residents were suggested to stay at home. So I asked the staff in Zhu if we could booking online, and the answer was yes. And we could make the booking by the WeChat group that Zhu created. But the efficiency of working with the WeChat group was very low and error-prone. The feedback for the first time online booking was unpleasant. Some residents complained about the late arrival and the quality issue. So I started to think about to do something to help reduce the disorder and minimize residents' gatherings. So here is what we did. First, I contacted staff in Zhu to express my concern and ask if we could set up a mechanism to make a booking from our building food captain, BFC, rather than in the WeChat group filled with more than 300 people and other pieces of information. We have two WeChat groups like this. And I collected the booking information from each BFC on behalf of Zhu and shared the final booking data with Zhu. After the first trial on April the 3rd, they agreed to change the way from WeChat group booking to BFC booking. And second, I start to build a system and network. I asked a neighbor to print the QR code. I start from being a BFC myself, and I asked our neighbor to print the QR code of the WeChat group of the building that I lived in, and then paste it at the entrance of the building so that everyone could notice, scan, and join it. And then I also entered some other WeChat groups about the community and told neighbors we could book online as long as there is a BFC in your building. If you didn't have a BFC in your building, you can recommend yourself as a BFC. We made it very clear that we need to stay together and connected to get through this time. And after several days, when more and more people were volunteering to be BFCs, I formed a WeChat group that contained all BFCs. In this way, I can collect and sort all booking information and forward that to Zhu, and the BFCs got a platform to communicate. By doing this, the workload of Zhu has decreased a lot, and they were able to focus on what I mentioned above, such as patients' requirements and elderly groups' special care. And I start to write and post guidelines for the community in terms of the food booking, because information about buying food was in pieces at the beginning. I spent much time focusing on the news of existing WeChat groups. I scanned the QR code to join whenever a new QR code appeared in the WeChat group of the community. Since there was too much information, I tried to sort out what is related to buying food and daily necessities, making it in shared notes and spreading it to all the WeChat groups that I am in. The guideline also includes information about the importance of BFCs and the urge to let neighbors to join in. And now after several rounds in order to achieve a better practice, the BFCs hold meetings after each round of booking so that every BFC can express their advice on optimizing their booking and delivering process and common questions from the neighborhoods in their buildings. I also created a WeChat group only used for Q&As of everything and block all the commercial activities inside this WeChat group to make sure my neighbors get direct and quick response to their questions. So here comes some interesting findings. The charts show the increasing trend of the BFCs. Last month, we got only 4 BFC at the very beginning, and we have 69 buildings. So there was a huge gap. And there is a very interesting day, which is April the 8th. We have 21 new BFCs within one day. And I will give you 5 seconds to think about what happened on April the 8th or the end of April the 7th. Okay, here comes the result. On April the 7th, I spent a whole day work and I feel dizzy. And I start to do something very interesting. I made a map about the community and simply for fun, but it turned out to be very, very efficient. And I marked each square represents a building, and I marked with the buildings with BFCs with blue and the rest with gray. And within one day, we got 21 more new BFCs. So the green one are the emerging BFCs on April the 8th. It's very interesting. So I titled it as the impact of data visualization. And I think people feel connected by putting all the buildings in one page. At the very beginning, I tried to use words and sheets to show the numbers of the BFCs, but it didn't work well until I made a map. And here is the most up-to-date data of the BFCs and its distributions in my community. We got 63 BFCs. And for the BFCs, the meaning of BFCs is not only about booking foods online. It builds bridges within the building so that people like the elderly could be taken care of by their neighbors, or at least be kept in an eye on. It also makes connections among the buildings so that most residents in the community are on the same page. It enhances mutual understanding between Zhu and the residents. So that's basically what I'm going to share for today.
Well, Kenney, that was absolutely fascinating. I have one question right away, which is, could you tell me the Chinese term for BFC? Some of our people in the audience would like to get the sense of what term you would use, in Putonghua.
Putonghua, it's like 团长.
Okay.
团长, yeah. But there is slight difference between 团长and BFC. For the BFC, we are only responsible for booking online and transfer the money to Zhu. And for 团长, they need to deal with the resource and deal with the distribution things, some other things. Yeah, so that's I didn't use the word 团长because there is a slight difference. Mm-hmm. And that's the answer.
Terrific. Terrific. Well, that was wonderful. Shitong, I'd love to put this in larger context. I know you've talked to a lot of people in Shanghai, but also you've just studied Shanghai neighborhoods, homeowners associations. So what can you tell us about this situation?
Sure. I actually have a couple of slides to share about the big picture. But first, just to go back to your question to Kenney. There are, generally speaking, there are three kinds of captains or 团长, right? What Kenney was doing basically is talk about the supply of food. Okay. Firstly, the government they do supply like a small portion of food for basic needs. That's for free, right? What actually Kenney has said, like the gift packages, right? 礼包, that's for free. That's I think about in Kenney's neighborhood it's about 20%, right? For free, basically for basic needs. Then in Kenney's neighborhood, what the Zhu, or what I would call the residence committee has done, which is actual and also very nice thing, is to purchase food, right? The Zhu, the residence committee, says they have purchased food, then distributed food to the residents of Kenney's neighborhood, right? So Kenney's role, as I understand it, is that he is the captain or captains, right? Or the building food owners or BFCs, right? So what they do is that they collect information from residents, right? What do they need, right? Then they send such information, the aggregated information, to the residence committee workers. Then the RCs, residence committees, then they purchase such food, right? Once the food is purchased and delivered to Kenney's neighborhood, then Kenney and other volunteers or captains, they would distribute such food, right? And also, right? So that's one kind of captain, like a direct connection with the RCs, and the RCs are actually buying food, not for free. They are going to pay, right? So for the food RCs have purchased. So that's one kind of captain. That's why Kenney said, oh, we are not exactly the captains as reported. So the second kind of captains are more spontaneous, right? They basically organize their own purchase groups. They find the suppliers, they find the delivery companies or delivery folks, right? They get the food to the neighborhood without much direct involvement of the residence committees, right? So it's more spontaneous. So that's the second kind of 团长 or captains. That's also the third one, which is actually who is actually themselves could be residents or not, could be, so themselves they have food, they are suppliers of food directly. So they because either they are residents in particular neighborhoods, or they have friends or agents in neighborhoods, so they also organize group shopping. So the third one, the last one, is more like directly commercial, right? So those are the three different kinds of food captains in Shanghai. So that's one. But the second one, I just want to say that I have done research about the neighborhood governance in the past basically 4 years. I cannot believe it has been so long, and have talked to 团长, food captains, and also just residents and also homeowners in Shanghai, mostly in the past months, and also in Shenzhen, which actually experienced a lockdown earlier this year, and also in Wuhan, basically asking about their food supply, and also group shopping and captains early in the spring of 2020. So in the following, I think 10 minutes, what I'm going to do is basically to share with you the bigger picture, right? So the question I have, I think probably also in many people's minds, right, about the lockdowns in Shanghai or lockdowns in Wuhan or in Shenzhen or in many other Chinese cities, I think there are two questions. The first one for me is that, is it really, how should I call such COVID control policies? Should we call it lockdown, meaning that somebody, right, or the government is locking people in their apartments, right? Or should we call it stay at home? I think it's a complicated question. I don't really have a definitive answer, but I guess in this presentation, I'd like to point out just one aspect of it is that you don't really, even in Shanghai or in Wuhan in 2020 spring, the government didn't really send the police to the gates or to the entrance of each neighborhood, right? Not to say the door of each apartment, right? So these residents, actually in Wuhan, 25 million of them, they were not forced to stay at their apartments because somebody is holding a gun at the entrance of their neighborhood, right? So that's to say, or at least that indicates this lockdown policy or stay at home order, whatever you call it, very much relies on the voluntary compliance of millions of residents in China. I think that's something we should keep in mind. The second one, of course, is when everybody is staying at home, right? Where the food is going to be from. And also in addition to food, there are also other COVID control policies. Just as Kenney has said, right? There are regular daily or even twice a day, right? The COVID tests, right? You have to get people not only stay at home, but also to come downstairs every day to do the test, right? So generally speaking, you have COVID control policies. You need people to follow, you need people to implement them, right? And also you have the basic life to maintain, food and everything, right? You also need people to do that. And the question for me is, who are the people, right, that are implementing COVID control policies and also maintaining the survival of residents in communities? So who are they? The answer is quite straightforward at this moment, right? It's Kenney. It's Mr. Kenney Zhu and thousands of them, right? Basically in the neighborhoods in Shanghai. They are doing the work. And I believe that Kenney Zhu, right, is who we need in Shanghai's neighborhoods, not only for COVID control, I think for many other things. So let me just try to break down the elements to support my argument of why it is actually Kenney Zhu and also other captains in Shanghai that are actually implementing COVID policies and also supporting community residents. So think about a neighborhood in urban China or in Shanghai, right? It has on average like 1,000, 2,000, or even like in Kenney's case, more than 3,000 households or apartments. So it's huge. But at this level, right, you have the residence committees, right, the RCs, which is what Kenney had called Zhu. Generally speaking, they are the lowest level, the end of the ritual state, the lowest level of the government, right? They are basically government employees, right? That's one part of it. But one RC has, I think, on average, like 3 to 6 workers, and that's it, right? That's it. So think about it, can these 3 to 6 people really govern and do everything neighborhood management by themselves? The answer is actually no, right? They are already overwhelmed. It's impossible for them to do everything by themselves. So Kenney's neighborhood is actually a little bit special. I would say it's kind of an exception in the sense that it's an old neighborhood, the so-called 老旧小区, right? So the buildings are old and they didn't really have a homeowners committee. They didn't even have, I would say, a real estate management companies. So yeah, it was a neighborhood basically managed by the RCs, right, with some kind of basic management service. But in the majority of the neighborhoods in Shanghai, they also have the homeowners associations, right, which is a democratic organization of the homeowners, of the residents, right? And the homeowners associations, they also hire management companies to maintain the neighborhood and do many things, including hiring security guards, right, for safety and security. So, but what I saw the commonality between Kenney's neighborhood, which does not have a HOA, and other neighborhoods in Shanghai is that it's all eventually is this group, right? Whether it's homeowners associations or just civic groups, such as group food shopping, like what Kenney Zhu has done, that are, I would say, equally important, at least equally important. I would say probably even more important in supplying food to the residents, to the members of the community, and also in implementing COVID policies, right? So that's interesting because eventually you can say at the very macro level, right? The state had to rely on spontaneous cooperation to govern and also to serve. I think that's something we tend to ignore in the Chinese context. The government just, purely by the cost of governance, just cannot do it by itself, or in this specific setting, cannot do it just by the 3 to 6 workers in the RCs. And when the government was trying to do that, just by the 3 to 6 workers in the RCs, that's when things went wrong. That actually explains many of the scandals you have heard about. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. Secondly, I just want to talk about. Okay, firstly, it's just a document I collected, right? Basically about group shopping. You don't have to read the Chinese characters. What I want to point out are just the 3 seals here, basically showing you who are in control in a Chinese neighborhood, right? It's basically the rules, right, or covenants, right, about how residents or homeowners, how they should conduct group shopping. What you have here is the seal of the RCs, the residence committees, and also the seal of the homeowners committees, and then the seal of the management companies. So the RCs, the HOAs, and the management companies, they are called the 3 horses, right? The three pillars of power in a typical Shanghai neighborhood, right? So that's important to keep in mind, right? But just to be a little bit more critical, to think about group shopping or to think about food captains, right? They are the heroes. They, again, they are essential to the whatever lockdown, right, in Shanghai or in other cities. But as Kenney knows very well, it's a very complicated business. I've talked to many quite a few food captains in Shanghai. There are actually lots of disputes, right? Because the currently in Shanghai, right, is on one hand, not only the government, the residents, the homeowners, they somehow wanted to reduce the chance of being infected, or at least reduce the number of COVID cases, because that's how they can get freedom, at least according to the government's agenda. Right? But group shopping, food delivery, food distribution, right? That can potentially get big crowds, right? And also human touch. So potentially that could increase COVID infection. So what people or members of community, what they are fighting with, or at least debating with each other is like, who should do the group shopping, right? How they should do it, right? And what kind of food to purchase, right? How much to purchase, right? And also when to purchase. All these kinds of problems. Not to say this group shopping is also a market transaction. And for market transaction, lawyers and economists, we know there are all kinds of problems, right? Enforcement of contracts, right? Could there be fraud, right? So there are all these different kinds of disputes. That's why, as I have shown you earlier, there are actually self-regulations promulgated by the HOAs, the RCs, and the management companies regarding basically regulating in detail how group shopping should be conducted. But theoretically speaking, I think there are 2 points. Firstly, such self-regulation, okay? Self-regulation without the involvement of police, without the involvement of courts, actually is working pretty well. So my friend Susan Finder has pointed to me that actually local basic courts in Shanghai, they have published their study reports just to remind food captains there could be risks, right, involved, or responsibilities and liabilities involved in organizing such group shopping. But so far, neither of us has found any like a judicial disputes, basically any dispute that has gone to court, right? So that's to say, again, it's mostly spontaneous cooperation and self-regulation that's working. And there are 2 specific mechanisms from my interviews. First one is just a reputation. It's actually reputation plays an effective role exactly because we are talking about specific neighborhoods and people know who you are, right? And you are in the same neighborhood and you have a reputation and you are expecting future interactions. So that's one, the mechanism of repetition in long-term repeated interactions really hold people accountable and captains accountable. So there were, I think, a couple of fraudulent cases. I think those cases involved mostly like outsiders, not insiders. So going back to the last category of the captains, like commercial vendors, right? They sometimes collected money but failed to deliver the food. But for neighbors, reputation mechanism works, I think, quite well, right? And the other mechanism relatedly is what we call ostracism. Basically, you get ostracized if you are a bad captain. We see that, I mean, for many reasons. Sometimes there are even scandals like captains harass the female neighbors, right? I mean, it's a big society, right? But also like other more ordinary common disputes. But you could get ostracized at least from the WeChat group, right? And even more worse, you could get just isolated in the neighborhood. And as you can understand, that could be a pretty serious punishment, right? So that's basically the mechanism of spontaneous cooperation and also self-regulation of group shopping in Shanghai's neighborhoods. So the last thing I want to say is about the role of the state. I'm a guy of private ordering, spontaneous cooperation. I think is fascinating, but for folks of my group, right, it's also just easy to assume that everything is spontaneous and the government is a separate animal, right? But I want to point out here, particularly from Kenney's story, right? You see actually a clear role of the state to play in this spontaneous cooperation. There are several functions of the state or the residence committees in Kenney's case, right? First one is information gathering and sharing, right? So Kenney wanted to complain not to another neighbor, right? Went to the RCs to say, okay, here's a problem. You guys are not doing a good job. I want to actually make the job, make it work much more effective, right? So, the RCs, they were supportive and also sharing information because they got more information than Kenney, right? At least back then. And also potentially in other neighborhoods, we saw, I think, first in Kenney's case, I think two other mechanisms is that credibility lending. Right? It's amazing in Kenney's neighborhood, 87% of people, they didn't really know each other. And Kenney himself told us earlier that he didn't really have much interactions with his neighborhoods before the pandemic. But now 87 of them are organized and are doing shopping together. I mean, Kenney is a great guy. I'm sure about it. But the question is, nobody knew about Kenney, right? Why would they join your group, right? I think potentially, Kenney, if you disagree, just let me know after my.
I agree with you.
Right, it's like he is somehow connected, not by long-term interactions, but because he went to talk to the RCs, right? And RCs said, this is okay, you should do this. That's kind of credibility lending, right? People say, okay, he actually has approval from a government. He's working with the government. So that actually makes Kenney a credible person in organizing the groups, right? And right, so that's the mechanism of credibility lending. And the second mechanism also can be told from Kenney's story is resource booster, right? Basically to say the RCs, they have more channels, right? They are more resourceful, they can find the food, right? So that's this resource booster is also facilitating Kenney's organization of food purchasing groups, right? So those are the information gathering and sharing, credibility lending, and resource booster, right? We saw that in Kenney's story. And in other neighborhoods, potentially, the RCs or the state, right? They can also be in charge of informal, right, mediation or dispute resolution. And in the worst scenario case, they could call police, right? So law enforcement. So I think the role, the state, the RCs, they do play a role, even in what we call purely spontaneous cooperation of residents. And that's actually also what I have found in the past 4 years of my study of the democratic self-governance of urban neighborhoods in China, right? All these homeowners associations actually a key to their success is to find a way to work with the RCs and let the RCs actually be supportive for their work, for their spontaneous cooperation and organization. And why are the RCs or why is the state doing that? Right? That's going back to probably the beginning of my question. What I call between the government and the residents is also kind of reciprocity, or what I call relational governance. Right? The idea is simply that, at least in the context of COVID, right, the RCs, again, they don't have enough manpower to enforce the lockdown policies, to do all kinds of stuff. So they have to rely on spontaneous cooperation, right? Civic organizations to do the job. And in exchange, they actually support for the spontaneous cooperation, the democratic self-governance. So this is a kind of relational governance and built upon repeated interactions, right? So I think that explains why the state, or specifically the RCs, are supporting the civic groups, the spontaneous cooperation. And I'll conclude with a sentence that trust, not only among neighbors, but equally important, trust between the government and the resident is equally important. And it goes both directions, not only the government's trust of residents, but also residents' trust of the government, right? So each party's past performance matter to mutual trust and also future interactions. I think this has lots of implications on broader issues, but I'll just stop here. And thanks, Kenney, again. And I think both Kenney and I would love to have questions.
Well, this is absolutely terrific. I was fascinated by this discussion. Some questions have come up in the chat, and I just want to highlight those. First of all, really basic question is, what's the Chinese term for homeowners association?
Yeah, for homeowners associations, that's 业主大会. Then for homeowners committees, which are the executive body of the HOAs, called 业委会.
Got it. And are the homeowners associations registered? What is their official role? With
that's actually an issue. Homeowners in China have fought for over a decade in the early 2000s. The Chinese term is registration versus approval. So according to law, they actually have to go to a government to register. That gives them a legal status, right? And so that they can open a bank account, so they can sign a contract with a management company, so that they can go to court to litigate. Without that kind of legal status, you are not existing, right? In the legal field. So by law, it's called registration. So the complaints from many homeowners, particularly in Beijing, is that the government, the street level government, the 街道办, right? That's above the RCs. They somehow have changed it to approval, right? Registration basically means without review, right? You just register, right? But approval means I do substantial review, see whether you guys are good guys, right? What guys you have done. So yeah, so it's a legally, short answer. They are legally recognized legal entities. That's why you also need a state, right? You cannot be just purely spontaneous. It's not a group of people just coming together to read books. So
now I got a lot of people are wondering, what's the role of renters in a homeowners association? And is there any difference between renters and homeowners, frictions, difference in behavior, etc.? And Kenney noted that he himself is a renter. So
yeah.
Okay, I'll just answer quickly, and then I think Kenney can share his experience. So I think in Kenney's neighborhood, there are also group shopping organized by homeowners, right? 业主. But his neighborhood is also a neighborhood with actually, I think, a relatively high percentage of renters, right? People who have rented apartments in this neighborhood. So I do think they are separate, right? And the problem with homeowners associations is that they are primarily concerned about their property, right? And it's based on the organization is also based on their ownership. So in that sense, it's not really covering the renters in the neighborhood. So that's why Kenney is here, right? And also, but one thing I just want to point out before Kenney answered is that I do think for the homeowners, you also see like the spillover effect, right? Like elders and the neighbors, they, for example, in the picture I have shown, right, the homeowners organizations, they also take care of that, and partially because the pressure from the RCs. So yeah, I think it's Kenney's time.
Now, some people in the chat noticed, wanted to know the effective age. We've talked a lot about helping elderly, but what about young people who can get on their scooters and just get out? You know, I mean, there might, how do you enlist young people? Now, when I see Kenney, I see somebody who's young, but maybe he just is lived healthily. He's not as young as I think he is. Everybody seems young to me because I'm like ancient right now. But how do young people get recruited to participate? And related to this is gender. You know, somebody noted in the chat, 90% of the captains are women. What's going on with that? And, you know, how does that have any effect on participation, or just comment?
For the BFCs, I think 35% of BFCs are male, and the rest are female. Yeah, which is slightly different from the general captain. Yeah, and for the young people, I think I do share some data to Professor Qiao, and he could answer this question.
Yeah. So I think from the data can you share with me? I think the volunteers they are generally quite young, right?
Yeah.
So they're generally quite young because that's what human beings do. They are more energetic. And about the gender, I just confirm what Kenney has said, and also from my conversations with other neighborhoods, people in other neighborhoods of Shanghai, yes, females I think are the majority. Fortunately or unfortunately, is more consistent with our stereotype of females in China. They are more like they are in charge of shopping even before the pandemic, and also just more familiar, much more detailed or detail-oriented, and much better than their male counterparts in doing the food shopping. You could also see that maybe females, I think they are much more altruistic, right? And also much more likely to volunteer. But just to say last word about the males, right? Is that I think the delivery, right? Like the distribution, I think in many cases are done by the males, right? Basically, when the food is delivered to a neighborhood, right? Sometimes it has to be carried upstairs. Who is doing that? I think those are, I think, more likely to be males who are doing that.
A couple of great questions. I mean, so many great questions. One is just about the relationship between volunteers who are not members of the party and party members who advise, organize, interact with volunteers. There's can you say, you mentioned that, you said, look, this is not totally government, it's not totally private, there's a complex interaction. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can say something, and then Kenney, if you have anything to add, you can do that. Sure. So firstly, I think that's a great question. It points to basically what Shanghai government has done, and also many city governments in China are doing right now. So before I started my project, after starting my project, is that the party finally realized that neighborhoods what they call the last inch of the state, right? They're talking about strengthening party leadership at the last inch of the state, right? Of the governance, basically at the neighborhoods. So for doing that, they are trying to basically to find out who are the party members, and ask the party members to basically report to the party branches at the neighborhood or the street level, right? So that's a question I have paid attention to in my study of neighborhood governance even before the pandemic. So the implementation really varies. I mean, one challenge, as you can understand, is that the street level government officials, they don't really have much leverage power over party members in the neighborhood, right? They don't really rely on you for making a living. They don't really rely on you for promotion, etc. And these party members, they themselves could be even higher, right, in the government than the street level office. So that being said, right, there are volunteers who are organized along the party line. So that's like one group of volunteers, which I would say could be more closely connected to the RSAs, and also more reliable, I would say, in the party's perspective. But I would say overall, that's just a very small part of it. Eventually, it has to really rely on just the residents and the homeowners themselves to do the job. Because eventually, I think this party identity, in my view, at least in the neighborhood level, is just much, much less important than the identity as a member of the community.
And Kenney, what do you think? Do you have something to add to that? I mean, you're right there on the ground. How is your interaction with party members or the party residence committee or government?
We don't really talk about this, or I haven't talked to anyone about this during the whole system is working. Yeah, we're not like, it's just about we're Chinese people and we are living here together. It's not about the parties things or government issues. We just want to stick together and get through this as soon as possible.
And I mean, this question came up, and there's a bunch I want to just queue up. One is people want to know about other cities, Beijing, Shenzhen, and also about migrants, people who might have recently arrived. Kenney has noted in the chat, he doesn't have hukou. So it's not like you have to have hukou to be a volunteer. Yeah. But it might make a difference how long you've been in Shanghai, or what, you know, how long you've worked in Shanghai. So what about different cities and different levels of time in Shanghai? Or
I started working in Shanghai in 2016. Yeah, so that I have been in Shanghai like for 6 years, less than 6 years. So that before that I worked back home. Yeah. So that's the answer.
Yeah, sure.
I can talk about at least Wuhan and Shenzhen. They had lockdowns. So my speculation, because I haven't done that extensive research, is like basically ask questions to people in Wuhan who experienced the 2020 spring lockdown, and also people in Shenzhen who experienced the lockdown earlier this year, right? I eventually came down to this specific question: can you still shop online during the lockdown? The answer was yes. So, and the answer is the same as in Shanghai. Is basically the government provided like very basic needs. I would say 20%, right? In Wuhan, the interviewee said 柴米油盐, right? Basically rice, you know, the cooking oil, whatever, right? But most of the stuff, the food, everything, that was supplied by their own either individual shopping or group shopping. So and in Shenzhen is the same thing. The interviewee said, oh, she was doing shopping every day, right? And all the stuff can be delivered, actually delivered on time, right? Basically in the same day to her neighborhood. So what I got, I mean, for the I think the question kind of indicated about the earlier chaos in Shanghai, right? People didn't get food, all this kind of stuff. My observation is that Shanghai shifted to this very draconian lockdown, like immediately, right? Because like a couple of days before, the Shanghai city government was saying that no worries, we're not going to implement any lockdown. Then, you know, the vice premier came to Shanghai, and then immediately there was a lockdown. And that lockdown, I think, was quite serious because the delivery folks, right, they didn't really have the freedom of mobility, right? So the food cannot really get into neighborhoods. So we saw that a lot, I think, at the very early days of the Shanghai lockdown. So my takeaway really from whether it's Shanghai or Wuhan, Shenzhen, is that people need at least the very basic freedom to shop, and the delivery folks, the delivery companies, the delivery platforms, they also need the freedom to send the food to individual neighborhoods, right? One number I got from a friend in Shanghai is that he said in Shanghai before the pandemic, there were like 1 million employees in the food supply and delivery related industries. So how many workers do we have in the residence committees in Shanghai? All of them, 50,000 people. That basically meant in the very early days of Shanghai lockdown, when the government was implementing the lockdown policies like very, very seriously, right? Nobody can move, all the government employees. It was relying on 50,000 people to do the work of 1 million people. Of course, there were going to be problems. We should all feel fortunate that, I'm not being sarcastic, or being sarcastic. We should feel fortunate that nothing more serious that had happened. So yeah.
Here's a question I have, and it may relate to some of the stuff in the chat, which is, I understand, I might have misunderstood, so you can clarify this for me, Kenney or Shitong. People didn't really know each other very well before this crisis. It wasn't like there was Shitong Qiao clubs or dancing clubs or exercise clubs. So why do they worry about ostracism? I mean, if I lived in a Shanghai residential complex, and I saw people, I waved to them, but I never really knew whether I saw the same person twice. If they gave me the cold shoulder, I guess if the bow-ons, gave me a dirty look, I'd feel bad. But exactly how does ostracism work when you're strangers, right? I want to know what motivates people. I mean, because this relates to another question, which was, why are you doing this, Kenney? What's in it for you? And the answer is nothing. He's just volunteering. But presumably there's some psychic, emotional reward. And so on one hand, there's an emotional reward, helping your neighbors, getting to know new people. There's also an emotional punishment. You get in the elevator and people look at you and then just give you the fisheye. So can you say a little bit more about that mechanism of informal enforcement and reward, and what it was like to be rewarded, and do you expect these connections to continue so people can continue to reap the awards of being social?
Yeah, you go first.
Okay, Kenney, I think y'all have to share with us your story of how you kicked out like some people from out of your WeChat group, right? That for me is kind of ostracism, right? People not following the rules, behaving badly, then you kick them out of your WeChat group. But let me talk about this, like people are strangers. Firstly, I would say in Kenney's group and in Kenney's story, that's true, right? It's a neighborhood without HOAs, with a relatively high percentage of elders and also high percentage of renters. That was probably true. But even in Kenney's story, I would argue that there were, a small percentage, you said like 13%, right? They had some kind of WeChat groups before this pandemic. But in many other neighborhoods, again, the picture I show you, right? You have RCs, you have HOAs, you have management companies. They actually have at least one group, right? The WeChat group of all the homeowners of the neighborhood. So that's actually most of the neighborhoods I have interviewed, not only in the pandemic, but before the pandemic, they did have that. So so it's not entirely strangers. So in that case, Kenney is actually more an exception rather than a typical neighborhood. So that's the first one. But second one, even talk about Kenney's case, right? They were strangers. Why should they care? I think they were strangers, but once once the groups were founded, people started shopping together and also distributing food together, they became, that's exactly to me a transformation of a neighborhood of strangers to a close-knit community, right? And the members, they care about each other because now you know each other. Now you know each other. Now you have a name in the neighborhood. So you're not strangers anymore. It's like on and off. Before it was off, now it's on, right? And again, right? Even if you had known each other only for a couple of days or 1 month, but you have a long-term expectation. I mean, you are going to live here. Of course, for renters, I think it's easier to move out, right? So I think that matters, right? For Chinese, once I know you, right, and I know we are going to have future interactions. I do care. So that's, I think, yeah, that's my answer. Yeah, Kenney.
I want say something about why I have a little bit. The reason why I faithful in building a network like this is, as I said, I traveled 17 countries. I've traveled to Europe, Asia, Africa, Oceania, and North America. So there's one thing everybody shares in common, or at least most people share in common. People need respect and people need connection. So that's what I always have in mind. So people need this. So that's how BFC system gonna work. So that's what I have in the very, very beginning. And so that's basically what I want to say about it. People need a connection. People need respect. So that's how BFC work.
Do you think that the connections are going to survive COVID and grow? In other words, are people going, after COVID goes away, as it surely will, do you think that these connections, WeChat groups, shopping groups, will evolve into recreational groups, or, you know, other kinds of socialization to solve other kinds of problems?
I think the function of the WeChat groups will decrease after the pandemic, but the connection between the residents or the rentees and the house owners, they're there. Just it won't fade that easily. Yeah, even after 10 years, when we talk about what happened 10 years ago, what we the night we stay there waiting for the vegetables and distribute the vegetable together, it's still a very memorable thing. Yeah, and I think everyone will keep that in mind. Yeah.
Now, not everybody has the same kind of governmental structure or private structure like a homeowners association. A question was in the chat was, what about construction site dormitories, or, you know, rentals that don't have much of a organization? You know, was there a structure in those areas?
For me, I'm also a rentee, and I don't have a hukou. It just only depends on how you think about yourself. It's not about how others think about it. You do things, everybody can see it. I don't have a hukou. I don't have an apartment here, but I'm still leading the BFCs, and everybody's trusting with each other. I think people need connections. People need respect, and more than hukou and owning an apartment or being wealthy.
I think for rentiers, I think it's going to be more challenging to maintain the connections, right? Particularly if you move out of a particular neighborhood. But I do agree with Kenney that some of connections are going to be there, just as I said, who have stayed, you know, in the midnight with you, you know, waiting for food and delivering to your neighbors. That kind of friendship is going to last, actually. So that's part of in the culture. But I guess for the how to say, one more word about neighborhood is that I think why this physical space is important. That's why, like, the residents, whether homeowners or renters, this group is easier to cooperate than, for example, like a random online groups, right? I mean, like hundreds of online groups on my WeChat, right? Why is like easier to maintain such groups based on the physical space? I think part of the reason is that you have a physical space there, so you have a very how to say, specific idea. Oh, which building is this guy in, right? Etc. And also another thing, at least in my research of homeowners, but also I think applicable to renters, is that it's a kind of common identity. It goes back to American stuff. It's location, 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 right? If you rent an apartment in this specific neighborhood, and somebody else of your similar age also rent an apartment in this neighborhood, that actually tells a lot about both of you. That tells actually both of you share a lot of things, right? Firstly, your level of your salaries, right, is probably quite similar to each other, like a same income group. And also secondly, you know, where you work is probably also close to each other. So it's like the physical space gives you, I think, gives homeowners, but also renters kind of common identity or even a similar taste. So I think that also has some kind of bonding effect.
And you know, this question arose. Look, you know, there's a lot of social class and social background dynamics in any city, whether it's New York City or Shanghai. And some people have noted videos where outsiders, who I assume are rural people, who've recently migrated and are manual laborers, maybe not with a lot of education, and certainly not with kids. They don't have their kids with them, might be treated differently or have more difficulty forming networkers than insiders. You know, and this relates to a question I have, which is the degree to which school-based or education-based networks matter. my experience is when my kids were school aged, before they went away to college, they were my way of meeting other people. And I'm guessing that in China, people who have kids in school of the same age probably are going to school nearby. Mm-hmm. And so that might be a way. They're waiting for their kids outside. They get to know each other. Mm-hmm. But of course, if you're a migrant laborer, you don't have your kids with you. You don't have school-based networks. Probably don't have the same professional networks. So how do those dynamics affect participation and ability to get access to food, or the likelihood that you'll have a food captain?
Sure. I think there are two questions. First, I just want to confirm, I'm a parent of a school-aged child. So in Hong Kong, in Durham now, sadly, 99% of my social connections are based on my child, right? Who she's socializing with. So that's true, at least in my research about homeowners and neighborhood governance in China before the pandemic. There are lots of parental groups, right? Like in Shenzhen, people were even organizing study groups for kids in the neighborhood because they are worried that better performance in Gaokao, the college entrance exam, could decrease the price of housing of neighborhood. So, and also other kinds of elders group, right? People who do the square dancing together, right? There are such groups in neighborhoods, but I think for neighborhoods with higher percentage of renters, like young professionals who don't have kids and busy with work, I think that's kind of case in Kenney, right? Is that kind of bonding, I think is probably much less. But the second part of your question, I think is more important, is about migrant workers, right? I think they are definitely in the much worse situation than residents or homeowners. So I have heard actually lots of stories. I'm sure many of you have heard, because what they are, for example, for the delivery of the free food, right, supplied by government, what they can do is that they distribute the food basically household by household, right? Homeowners or residents, at least the residents committees, they know you are there. But for what I call 群租, like a group rentals, kind of illegal, right? You have one apartment with lots of renters. I mean, mostly like really people who don't make much money. Sometimes they just didn't get enough food, at least for the food supplied by the government, because the government didn't have the information that, oh, you actually have 20 people, right, in this house or in this neighborhood. And migrant workers, right, that's also not in the official system, therefore probably not fully taken into consideration, at least for the government to deliver the basic food. But I'll take this again as supporting my basic point that the government was doing lots of stuff, but when you relied purely on the government for survival, right, like distributing free food, I think that's just going to be very problematic. And what we're talking about, migrant workers, people in group rentals, that's just one example of the inefficiency or the inadequacy of government distribution and supply of food. And for migrant workers, actually, we also saw, I didn't do the interviews, and I mean, from credible news sources, like the spontaneous cooperation. There's a wide circulated news about the cooperation among truck drivers, right? Like Shanghai is a city of 25 million people. You need lots of trucks, delivering food, not only within Shanghai, but really from other places of China and delivering food to Shanghai. What happened is that the government had lots of regulations, right, and permits and the COVID tests, and many of them actually kind of stuck, right, in the outer skirt of Shanghai, because they were not letting Shanghai, they were not letting out or back to where they are from. So they had big trucks of supplies, but themselves had difficulties and big challenges of getting food. What happened, at least according to this report I have read, is that they basically, again, organized their own groups, right? It's very, elementary, right? They built the cooking facilities. Really, it's more like 2,000 years ago, right? They made a fire, they find a shelter, they cooking food. And what happened is that they did not only cook food for themselves, they also cook food for other folks. And for truck drivers, they might not have the labor unions, but again, they have informal networks, right? Truck drivers from Henan, right? They have their own WeChat groups. And actually they distributed such information, basically say, oh, this is where our shelter is based, right? You are very welcome to come to our place. We have some basic food to share. So we saw such stories. So again, my point is that in many cases, it's really spontaneous cooperation, right? Not official labor unions, but informal networks, WeChat groups, that's really at work. But I do think, right, we should pay more attention to this, I think, much more, I would say, unfortunately, marginalized groups in Shanghai. So.
You know, Kenney, I have to ask you this. It's related to exactly what Shitong said. This question arose in the chat. Where did you get your models for organization? Did you just develop from scratch, common sense? Did you get them from previous models in the past? You've traveled all over the place. Did you say, hey, when I was passing through New York and Copenhagen, I saw that they had these kinds of neighborhood associations? Where did that go? How did you learn this stuff?
Just my instinct. Yeah. Maybe, I don't know. I don't know where do I get this. Just, it has nothing to do with my work experience, I think. I'm only faced for in people need a connection, people need respect, as I like said. So I just, and I also mentioned that the BFCs, we hold meetings after each round of booking, and we listen to each other and to have a best practice within this community and within this certain time. Yeah.
Was it helpful to have the Juwei structure, the resident committee, so that you had somebody to go to give you approval? I'm sure Tong mentions credibility lending. You know, I mean, did it help that you had gone to some kind of official organization first and they said, yeah, we need your help, go ahead. And then when you tried to recruit people, you said, look, you know.
Oh, no. Just quite the opposite. Because at the very beginning, there is like relatively misunderstanding between Juwei and the residents. So what I said, the BSC is like connecting the Juwei and the residents, and connecting the buildings and connecting the resident with the government. So I'm not on behalf of the government. I'm on behalf of the people, on behalf of the residents, or at least on behalf of me. Yeah.
Now, this question came up in various ways, but basically the point was made that there were different levels of lockdown based on the residence committee's interpretation of what lockdown meant. Like maybe you had to stay in your apartment, or maybe you could wander through the building. Maybe you could go outside if it was a lane neighborhood in the alley. The question arose, was there debate about the meaning and the merits of lockdown and the degree of lockdown, either within the spontaneous organizations that arose, the homeowners associations, the Juwei? Did that happen at the micro level, the neighborhood level, that kind of debate?
I think Shitong can.
Yeah, I can do it.
He has a bigger picture than me. Yeah.
Okay, I can do it. So yeah, we can have a dictionary after all the COVID is done, right? Like all these different terms the government has created. I'm sure for their good reasons, but you have 封控区、管控区、防控区, basically different areas of with different levels of control, right? Basically depending on the number of COVID cases, right? In Shanghai. So yeah, so that's one, right? So the second one is this big question about the debate of about COVID policy. I saw that a lot online, right, from social media. Many people, I think, within Shanghai and also outside of Shanghai, questioning, right, the COVID policy, this zero COVID policy. And from many resources we have seen, right, have heard recordings, right, even officials within the government, particularly in Shanghai, right, had questions about this zero COVID policy. So that's one. Second one, I guess, is from my field work, basically talking to people in Shanghai, like more recently. That goes back to my point about how to implement such big scale lockdown, right, without sending even a police to each neighborhood, right? I mean, Peking, right? Peking, basically the neighborhood police, each of them actually in charge of several neighborhoods, not just one, right? So it's not really relying on a police with a gun to enforce the lockdown policy. So when I was talking to people, I think this is probably a partial picture, is that, again, going back to my point, right? This tension between COVID control, reducing the number of COVID, and food delivery, all these kinds of activities that can potentially increase the number of COVID infections. What I say is that I have to say those people I have talked to, more or less, I mean, this is not precise, they don't really try to, I think they probably have their own questions. They do. But I don't see like very, I mean, there are, we see on social media, right? But this is like a more ordinary folks. I don't see them like us trying to really challenge basically the fundamental COVID control policy at this moment. And I would speculate that, I suspect that's probably still the basic approach taken by the majority of the residents in Shanghai. But I do say, even in social media, in some cases, the volunteers, the residents, right, they had debates, they had quarrels with the RCs, right, government employees, about the implementation of COVID control policies. For example, in this widely circulated video, the volunteers basically declined the request of RCs to seal a particular building, right? And their challenge was that, oh, the sale, right, the Fengtiao didn't even have an official sale, right? It didn't really have the beginning date, didn't really have an end date, right? The RCs cannot really show the documents from the right, the district level government, right, about this sale, right? And the argument is that you cannot sell this building, and we are not going to help you with this, because if you do that, I think there was that 我们怎么做人, right? We just cannot do this anymore, right? We are not going to be a volunteer anymore if you do this unreasonable thing. So that's what I kind of call, like, again, going back to my my thesis of relational governance. I think most people, they don't try to challenge the government at the fundamental level. I mean, there are complaints and not on social media potential that could lead to change, but they wouldn't do that, reach that fundamental challenge, right? Most of the cases, they wouldn't do that. But it's mostly within this confined zone, they are trying to raise questions, basically to say this is not legally proper, right? You shouldn't do this without proper approval and things like that. But I do think there's a big space, the public space of social media, or just generally speaking, the space of media. I think that's powerful and something I have not studied and could potentially leading to the change of the government policy. But that's, I would say, overall, the Chinese approach, these residents, I think they are overall much less confrontational than, I don't know, their counterparts in other countries. So.
Well, I mean, this question was in the chats, and do you think the top leadership predicted and even counted on spontaneous grassroots volunteers to make this policy work? Or do you think that was just lucky?
That's a great question. I would say, at least at the very first days of the Shanghai lockdown, I would say clearly the government didn't anticipate that. The government was totally trying to mobilize the bureaucratic system of Shanghai, which for many reasons was not as successful as it should have been, right? And this group shopping, I don't think it was coordinated. It was not really under the government's like explicit policy, right? These were really spontaneous and emerging cooperation by people. People just wanted the food, and they are using their common sense, right? And also accumulating their social capital to find the suppliers and also to navigate through the bureaucratic structure to get food into the neighborhood. What we saw is that, at least in the early days, is that the government just created too many, I mean, maybe not intentionally, but at least for the purpose of COVID control, right? Created too many roadblocks, right? And instituted too many permits, right? You need permits to supply food. You need permits to run around. All these kinds of things, which I think, at least in the early days of Shanghai lockdown, severely slowed down, right? The spontaneous cooperation. So I would say it's not really in the government's plan, but now I think the government knew and was trying to support and also trying to regulate such spontaneous cooperation. But I do think the government now, they should be aware that the spontaneous cooperation of residents and also the force of the market, like the big delivery platforms like Jingdong, they are just essential to the success of their lockdown policies. Again, you cannot have 50,000 people do the job of 1 million people. So I think the government would and will take that into consideration. Otherwise, it will be just pure stupidity. So
you think the government is learning from what's going on here? Do you think they'll incorporate this into party management? That is to say, non-party volunteers as part of managing other problems? Because it's not like, COVID will be the only problem that people have to confront.
As a rational actor and as a rational mayor in China, I would definitely do that. Because again, just if you don't do that, it's not going to work. The COVID policy or whatever policy is there, it's not going to work. So.
Wow. Well, Kenney and Shitong, I think we've gone through all the questions. I see so many of my friends from Shanghai in the participant list. Many of them were my colleagues there, and I'm checking the chats to see other questions that we may have missed. One question that is sort of a global question, it's not about China, it's about the West, which is that this picture that you're painting of how life works in Shanghai and people interact in Shanghai is not been communicated very well in the Western media. That was one question. And is that true? And why do you think that is?
Sorry, I was, could you repeat your question? I got lost. Yeah. I was looking at the chatting box.
Oh yeah, no, it's a good thing to, I mean, it just, the idea is the portrayals of Shanghai have been mostly of desperate crisis and of people who are not, solving problems. This picture is a little bit different from that. This is a portrait that you can say the New York Times. Why is this other image of China not getting out?
I think Kenney and I, we were talking about this, right? It's, I think people, I mean, I think it's totally justifiable and it's right for the media and for people to pay attention, to pay actually much more attention to things that to bad things that have happened. And that's right to do. And we want to push the government to give them pressure to make things right, right? I mean, that's just the media's nature, and right? And I think what we are trying to do here is just to, for me as a scholar, I'm just trying to understand what things work, what things do not work. For me, my baseline is pretty low. It's like, that's not a revolution and people are leaving. I mean, there are lots of scandals, but I haven't heard about one story in which people have starved to death, like right? So for me, that's something, something to understand. And And again, the government itself, like a direct command and control, was maybe part of the reason, but equally important is what we call the spontaneous cooperation here. So,
well, this is great. You know, we have a few more minutes. I'm looking for more questions from our folks online.
There are more questions from.
Yeah. Oh, I see. The question arose, censorship on social media was quite heavy. And on the night of 22nd of April, there was an online protest. Do you guys have any feelings about this?
About the censorship?
Yeah, and how it affected organizational capacity, or any thoughts at all?
Yeah, I'm just surprised. I mean, there are many things. First, it's just to be clear, there are many things we don't know. So our topic is purely about neighborhood governance. I was just as an observer and a researcher of China. There are lots of censorship. I mean, many videos I found today, I couldn't find it. Next day I have to. Now I have learned that I need to download all of them. The first time I saw them, right? But I was surprised in the sense that actually there had not been more censorship. In a sense that actually online you see clearly critiques of the government's zero COVID policy and reports on the bad things that had happened during the lockdown, right? Not only social media, but including some official newspapers in Shanghai and in Beijing. So I guess my first observation to me is that was kind of a surprise to me. So I don't know, there are many things I don't know, but one thing I think that like one reason for it, I would say, this is just such a, a big city of 25 million people. You cannot just pretend that nothing happened. And so it's even with all the technologies of censorship, I think it's just difficult to censor everything and to pretend that lockdown was a beautiful story, right? The government was, I think, can try to shape the narratives, basically to say, there are different sides, but I don't think in the era of social media, even just talking about the Chinese side, when you have this 25 million people and lockdown, I don't think you can lock down all the information and just convey kind of information that the government wanted. So, yeah.
Well, I have, there's one more question that was repeated and I wasn't quite sure how to interpret it. You can see it in the chat, but it's this question about the term building food captain. It was suggested that this puts the emphasis on a kind of individual building oriented perspective, that the individual buildings in the sense were an organizational unit. Care to comment on that idea?
Sorry, I was looking at the chat again. So.
Yeah, I mean, just the idea that the buildings, this relates to another question. I kind of put these together, which is how can these spontaneous bonds that arose during a crisis be sustained? Is it just a WeChat group? Don't you need an institution so they can go on to do other things in order to sustain these ties?
Yeah.
And then there's a much more specific question, which is in using the phrase building food captain, the emphasis is on the individual building. And one might say, does that mean the building itself becomes a kind of organization? Can it be the basis for an organization? Could you imagine the building Shangqi Club, the building Square Dancing Club, the building you name it club? And that could be used to maintain these relationships, the building shopping club. I invite you to interpret the question any way you want, with the general idea that maybe ties which people need require institutions as well as just a desire.
So, Kenney, you want to talk about building how you connect to other captains in other buildings, or?
For within my community, we only initially we only start with WeChat groups, and then we buy food together and we distribute, meet each other and build like a deep trust. So that's how things work. We only use WeChat to communicate. We're not we're not be able to meet other people very frequently and very closely. We are all we haven't see each other's face because we all have our mask on. Yeah.
So I think for Kenney, the organization of food shopping or organization by buildings, I think the other reason basically, I think for the I think there are two reasons. First one is for the distribution of food, right? Is eventually you have to distribute food by building, right? That's just one thing. And the second thing I would say, yes, it's based on individual buildings, but again, I think the audience might have forgotten, Kenney is the captain of captains. So that's to say you have 63 buildings, right? Each building has a food captain, but Kenney is connecting all of them, right? Is collecting all the information about their demand of food, right? Accumulate all the information, then organize all these building food captains together to get food and then distribute food by food. So I think that's just some kind of clarification. But the bigger question is like, how are you going to sustain, right, such spontaneous cooperation? Do you need some kind of institutions? So this is from like other parts of my my conversations with other people in Shanghai, mostly homeowners. So what I got from some homeowner activists in Shanghai is that they think this is going to actually have, because of the mobilization in this pandemic, right? The broader participation in the group food shopping, because each household needs food, right? People got to know each other, and also you have this building by building groups, right? Basically, each building now you have a leader or kind of a volunteer. They think, some of them thought that this would have actually the profound impact on future participation. For example, in the homeowners associations, if it's a purely or mostly homeowner-dominated neighborhood. And some of my colleagues in Shanghai, sociologists, even argue that this might have an impact on the elections of the residence committees, which is supposed to be elected by residents, so not only homeowners. So for that one, I'm less optimistic, basically because the RCs are much more directly controlled by the government, and people have a much less, sense of belonging to such RCs. But I think one thing for sure is that in the future, the government actually, we already see that. Not only the city governments, but central government came to realize actually the importance of neighborhood governance for the overall governance in China. So in the future, it's going to be, the continuous balance or fighting or tension between the top-down governance goals, right? Could be COVID control, could be other things, and the more spontaneous cooperations, right? So that, I think, answers one question in the chatting box, is like, is it more for control or more for spontaneous cooperation? I think it's a mixture, right? The balance is okay. So,
well, I see that we're basically have a minute left, and this brings us to the end, if I got the time right. And so I just think right now, I just want to thank Shitong and Kenney so much for giving us this picture of life in Shanghai and how civil society and individuals can organize to solve problems. It's been really interesting and terrific. So thank you very much for a great presentation.
Thank you, everyone.